Want to make your sculpts look like they belong in a professional stop-motion film? In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through a 5-step system to build a hyper-realistic clay material in Blender, perfect for showcasing your sculpting work. You'll learn how to add natural color, beautiful bump maps, displacement, and realistic scratches and fingerprints for that classic claymation look. And we'll wrap it all into a single, easy-to-use shader so you can use it in any project. To make it super simple, I've included a free Blender file below, complete with all the textures and one of my sculpted creatures, so you can follow along step by step. If you'd like to make creatures like this, check out my Creature Kitbash add-on. It has over 300 monstrous body parts and lets you mash them together like Lego bricks to create creatures like these in minutes. In the download, you should have both a sphere and my sculpted creature in the scene, as well as a reference image in the image editor on the left. We're currently in the shading workspace. By default, Blender usually starts us off in the layout workspace, but the shading workspace has easier access to all the tools we'll be using in this tutorial. Color is where realism begins. Real clay isn't a perfectly flat shade. It has subtle shifts where different clays have been mixed together, or where dirt has collected. For this tutorial, I'll follow the reference image, but I'll show you later how we can build some extra controls in to give us all of these color variations. Using the shortcut Shift-A, we can bring up the Add menu. Start by adding a noise texture, add a color ramp, and a mix node. Plug the factor of the noise texture into the color ramp, then the color from the ramp into the factor on the mix node. And finally, you can plug the result of the mix node into the base color on your principled BSDF shader. You can hold down Shift and Control and left click on any node and Blender will preview that node. If I preview the noise texture, you may not be able to see very much. That's because by default, the noise texture doesn't give you a lot of contrast between its black and white values. This is why I like to add the color ramp, so instead let's preview the color ramp, again by holding Shift Control and clicking. Then I can drag both the black and white values closer towards the middle to increase the contrast. Now we have the values set, we can add some color. For now, I'm going to click on the top color swatch and use the color picker to pick one of the darkest values from our reference image. Then I'll do the same with the lower swatch and pick one of the lightest values from the reference image. Feel free to adjust these to your liking. If you're working with a simple sphere, that's all you need, but let's have a look at how we can get even more detail from using that high polygon sculpt. We have two nodes that we can use here. Firstly, you want an ambient occlusion node, and we'll add another color ramp so that we can play with the contrast later. If you're using Eevee, that's all you need, but if you're using cycles for rendering, we can also add a geometry node to add even more detail. And we'll duplicate that ramp again so that we can fiddle with the contrast. Ambient occlusion works by detecting where parts of an object are close to each other, so you'll see that inside the mouth is almost completely black, whereas around the stomach it's almost all white. For the geometry node, we want the pointiness slot plugging into our ramp. This looks at our model and makes the parts that are sticking out of the mesh white and the parts that are sticking in, like the wrinkles, black. By default, there isn't anywhere near enough contrast, so crunch the black and white values on your ramp much closer together, almost at the middle. It's very easy to overdo this, so do try and keep it subtle. Finally, we can add both the pointiness and the ambient occlusion together using a mix node and setting it to multiply. Now we can create another mix node and plug in the colors we created earlier into the top slot, and the details into the bottom. I like setting this node to overlay so it picks up both the black and white values to mix into our colors. This creates a base color for us to build from, and if we preview the final shader, this is already starting to look like clay. At this point, you might want to dial in how shiny or wet you want your clay to look with the roughness. I'm going to set mine to 0.4. And dial in both the colors on the mix node and how much noisy detail you want from that noise texture. In this case, the default values work pretty well, but that might be different if you're using your own model. Let's select all the nodes that make up our color and press Ctrl-J. This creates a frame around all of those nodes. This won't affect the final material, it just keeps things clean and organized. You can rename the frame by pressing F2, or you can change it in the side panel. The shortcut to bring up the side panel is the N key. Nothing screams, "computer generated," louder than a perfect surface. So although we'll be adding some deliberate details in the form of fingerprints and scratches, we also want some purely random noise. Clay has a pretty specific noise pattern to it, and because of this, we're going to want to build our own custom noise. That makes it sound really complicated, but don't worry. All we're going to do is take 3 noise textures, stretch them, and distort them slightly so that they look swirly, and then combine them all. Start with a single noise texture. To stretch this, we're going to need the mapping node. So with the noise selected, press Ctrl-T. Then down in the scale section, set the Y scale to 3. You can see on the sphere that we start to get this kind of swirl happening. To add a bit more randomness to it, set the distortion on the noise texture to 1. We'll also set the detail to 5. This is a great start, but you can see, particularly on the wyvern, the noise is kind of going all in one direction. We want this to crisscross more. So duplicate everything, and this time change the mapping on the X scale to 3 and leave the Y and Z set to 1. If we flip back and forth between the noise textures, you can see that the swirls are going in different directions. Now, you guessed it, we want another noise texture, this time with the scale set to 3 on the Z scale. So duplicate everything again and set Z scale to 3. Now we just need to combine all 3 of them with a couple of mix nodes. Create one mix node, connect the top 2 noises and set the mixing type to overlay and the factor to 1. This will blend both the black and white values into each other. Duplicate the mix node, connect the first mix node into the top slot and the final noise texture into the bottom slot. We want all this randomness to affect both the roughness of our model and the bumpiness, so plug the final mix node directly into the roughness, then create a bump node and connect that same mix node into the height and the normal output into the normal input of your shader. Set the strength to around 0.2. Grab all the nodes related to building this custom noise and press Ctrl J to add a frame around all of them. Press F2 and rename it to noise. Fingerprints are an inevitable part of working with clay. These tiny marks are what separates CGI from stop motion magic, so we really need them to have our material looking right. For the fingerprints, we're going to use an image texture. Create an image texture. From the drop-down, you should be able to find a fingerprints image. Websites like Ambient CG have a number of these fingerprints you can download for free, and I'll make sure that there's a link in the description. This texture most likely looks a little stretched in places. To fix this, change the projection type on the image texture from flat to box. If you can still see any seam lines, turn the blend up a little bit to smooth them out. You can see the fingerprints on the wyvern are much larger than on the sphere. Select the image texture and press Ctrl T to add a mapping node and texture coordinates. Swap the generated slot on the texture coordinates over to the object to get an even distribution between the sphere and the wyvern. We're going to turn these fingerprints into a bump map. On a bump map, white values get pushed out of the model, while black values get pushed in. So right now our fingerprints will be pushing out of the model, which isn't what we want. To fix this, plug the fingerprints into a color ramp and use this somewhat hidden drop-down menu so we can flip the colors. You might want to drag the black down a little bit to make the fingerprints more obvious. Right now we have a ton of fingerprints, and really we don't want quite that many. Using the color ramp, drag the white values up slowly to remove some of the fingerprints. Now this can be a little bit difficult to see, so let's create a bump node. To give us the most control later, we're going to connect multiple bump nodes together. Create a new bump node and plug in the fingerprints. Set the strength to around 0.2 and preview it. Now you can drag the white value on the color ramp and you should have an easier time seeing how many fingerprints you have left. Once you're happy with how strong the fingerprints are, we can connect it into the first bump node we created for the random noise. To do this, just connect the normal output from the fingerprints bump into the normal on the random noise bump. If you preview the second bump, you should now be able to see both the random noise and the fingerprints. Feel free to tweak the strength of both of these until you get something you like. Let's grab all the fingerprints nodes and add them into their own frame like we did with the color. I'll press F2 and rename it to fingerprints. Now the fingerprints won't just affect the bumpiness. The oils in your skin will subtly darken the color of the clay. These small details may not be noticeable from far off, but it's often these small touches that make something look truly photorealistic. So we're going to want to plug the fingerprints into our color frame at the top. To do this, create a new mix node and drop it in between the last mix node and the shader. It should automatically connect the node. Set it to multiply, then go all the way down to the bottom and grab the color output from the fingerprints ramp and connect it to the bottom slot of the multiply node we just created. Preview this node and adjust the factor to something you like. I'd suggest keeping it relatively subtle. I have mine set to 0.5 so that you can see it in this tutorial, but for realism, you probably want to set this closer to something like 0.2. Even in the most professional workspaces, clay will still dry and crack, and tools will leave little marks and impressions. These imperfections are part of what makes it feel real. So let's push this material from good to great by layering in some subtle surface scratches. They're small, but they add a ton of realism. To speed things up, let's start by taking the entire fingerprints frame and duplicating everything with Shift D. Then go to the image texture and from the drop-down, select the scratches image. Preview the color ramp and adjust the sliders until you can see the scratches better. Now, this is a lot of scratches. We don't really want the whole model to be covered in them. So let's use a noise texture and mask some of them out. To do this, create a noise texture and connect it to a color ramp. Set the scale to around 10 and the detail to 5, and then crunch the black and white values on the ramp closer together. If you preview this, the white areas are where our scratches will be, and the black parts will get masked out. Create a new mix node, plug the scratches ramp into the bottom slot, and set the top slot to be pure white. Then plug the mask ramp into the factor. You can now use the mask ramp to dial in how many scratches you want. Again, we want these scratches to affect both our bump and the color. Add another bump node and plug the scratches into the height, then connect the new bump node into the chain of bump nodes we've already created. Set the height to around 0.35. This will be our last bump node, so let's grab all three of these nodes and chuck them into their own frame. Up in the color frame, create a final mix node, drop it between the previous mix node and the shader, and set it to add. Then grab the output from the scratches frame and plug it into the mix node back at the top. Now we have a slight problem here. Our scratches are set so that the scratches are black and the rest is white, which is now blowing out our color. To fix this, create an invert color node and drop it onto our connection line going into the add node. This will flip the colors and allow us to see the scratches in our color. This is really strong, so let's dial this down to around 0.1. Here's a little secret. Even with all of that detail, our clay still looks CGI because the silhouette is too perfect. The wyvern looks great because the sculpt is breaking up its silhouette, but the sphere looks flat. And I mean that literally. If you look at the silhouette, it's a perfect curve, and that makes it look like it was made in a computer. A simple way to break up the surface is to select the sphere, go to the modifiers, and add a subdivision surface modifier and a displace modifier. On the displace modifier, click the new button to add a texture, then click this little button at the end to go to the texture settings. Change it from an image texture to clouds, and change the scale to 0.05. Go back to the modifiers tab and change the displace strength to 0.01. You can play with both the scale and strength settings to get something that you like, but you only need it to be relatively subtle to break up that silhouette. You could do the same thing with the wyvern model, but you'll need to keep the settings relatively low or his details will start to break. And now for the final touch, the thing that makes clay feel like clay, and that's light bouncing into it. This effect is called subsurface scattering, and I've deliberately left it until last as it can add a little bit of render time. This setting simulates light bouncing inside your model and then back out again, and without it, even the greatest shaders can look plastic. It can be found on the BSDF shader. Under Surface, set the weight to around 0.5 and the scale to 0.1. Now, how high these values need to be depends on the size of your model. In this case, the wyvern model is around about 1 meter tall, and setting the scale to 0.1 means that the light is bouncing into the model around 10 centimeters before bouncing back out again. If the wyvern were around the size of a dragon, say 5 meters tall, you'd want to bump up the scale to around 0.5 or 50 centimeters into the skin. This material network is getting pretty complicated, so let's simplify everything by turning it into a node group with custom controls. To do this, press A to select every single node, then make sure to deselect the material output node. Press Ctrl G to create the node group. This will take all of those nodes and put them inside the new node group. You should be able to find a group input and a group output node. If you press Tab, you'll return to the view outside of the group node. Selecting the node group and pressing Tab again will take you back inside. The first control that I want to build is the ability to change the color of the clay. We could connect the color swatches, but a more intuitive way is to add a hue and saturation node. So create a hue, saturation, and value node and drop it right after the mix node with all of our color swatches. Then connect the hue, saturation, and value inputs individually back into the group input node. If we tab back out, you'll see that we now have those controls on our node group and we can adjust them from here. Using the hue, we can change our clay to a more colourful Play-Doh style, which is great if we want those claymation characters rather than realistic sculpting clay. Let's hook up a few more nodes to give us all of the controls that we need. Press Tab to go back inside the node group. As well as color, I'd really like control over how shiny or dry the clay looks. To do this, we'll add a math node and drop it in before the roughness connection. By default, this should be set to add, which is what we want. Drag the bottom connector back into our group input node. Annoyingly, we now have two controls named value, and that's going to get confusing. So press the N key to bring up the side panel and double click the second value to rename it. Call it roughness. By default, Blender allows you to set this value to anything you want, but if we preview this node, you can see that values below -1 are pure black, and values above 1 are pure white. So setting this to 1000 looks exactly the same as setting it to 1. This could also be confusing, so let's set a min and max value. Set the min to -1 and the max to 1. Back outside the node group, you can see that we can't drag the roughness past these values. I'd really like to connect the subsurface weight too, so let's connect that back into our group input. Now let's connect all of our details like the noise, fingerprints, and scratches. Let's start by controlling the scale of our random noise. To do this, connect the scale value on each of the noise textures back into the input group. You can connect multiple nodes back into a single controller on the group input node. This might be a little hard to see, so let's also connect the strength on the bump node into the input group. This should be the final bump node in our chain. It's probably worth renaming the scale and strength controllers to noise scale and noise bump. Now if you crank up the bump and adjust the scale, it should be easy to see what it's doing. Hopefully you're getting the hang of this now, so let's quickly connect controls for the fingerprints and the scratches. For the fingerprints, we'll want color, so connect the factor on the multiply node in the color frame. Change its name to Fingerprints Color. Then down at the bottom of our tree, connect the scale on the mapping node and rename this to Fingerprints Scale. Also change its type from vector to float. And finally, connect the middle bump node strength and name this Fingerprints Bump. Outside of the node group, you can now control how many fingerprints there are, how dark you want them to appear, and how deep you want the bump map to be. Finally, let's connect all the same nodes for the scratches. Connect the add node and name it to Scratches Color. Connect the scale on the mapping node for the scratches frame and rename it to Scratches Scale. Don't forget to change its type to float. And finally, connect the first bump node in our chain and rename it Scratches Bump. If you've made it this far, nicely done. You've built a stunning clay material from scratch, but we're not done yet. For those of you wanting to take it even further, I've included a version of the shader set up for animation, with the noise, fingerprint, and scratches subtly shifting on every frame to really sell that stop motion look. The node group will have an extra control to enable or disable this animation effect as you like. You can grab it now from my Gumroad page, it's free and the link is in the description. Don't forget to check out Creature Kitbash, and if you want to keep leveling up your shader skills, this next video on building hyper-realistic metal materials should be your next watch.